Good morning, everyone. So I passed the first stage gate. I got up here without tripping, which I did last time I came up here. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the key elements of implementing advanced analytics programs inside of organizations. And what I'm focusing on is more leveraging the BI infrastructure and the data warehouse infrastructures that we have in place, but getting beyond that data regurgitation, getting beyond only talking about what has happened, but starting to implement all the disciplines and the ecosystems within an organization so that we can move into more predictive-based, future outcome forecasting analytics programs. And how do I integrate that into my organization that's probably pretty rich in architecture, rich in methods, rich in disciplines, rich in governance, and rich in culture. So that's going to be the focus today. First, just to make a case for analytics, my premise when I'm talking about predictive analytics, the whole goal, the primary goal, and this is with BI as well as predictive and advanced analytics, is to optimize the performance of every function within the organization. Because if I'm optimizing the performance of product development, market development, campaign management, sales activity management, order fulfillment, customer service, I am going to be outpacing my competitor. And if I can use predictive analytics as a basis for optimizing those functions, that's going to be my key to getting to that competitive advantage state. And it starts with business process discovery. And I get on my soapbox a lot. We are, as an industry, we're very good at focusing around data, because we know data is the only empirical means by which we can measure anything. It's the objective outputs that we can calculate measures and understand performance. But if we don't put it in context of the business functions, we're missing a big contextual piece. And when I'm talking about business process discovery, the goal is to get underneath those functions down to the key activities and find out what are the value streams of information flow moving between those processes. So whether I do top-down business process modeling, which very, very few organizations are doing on a regular basis, I do my little informal survey when I teach classes, and I ask how many people have built a process model for their organization, and maybe 2% on average. And then I ask how many of those process models are kept up to date. Half of those hands go down as well. So if you do that top-down process modeling, which is arduous but very fruitful, or if you start to take advantage of some of these automated business process discovery tools that are out there that actually read the logs off your systems and build process flow for you, the insight is you start to find where do you have scrap and rework happening throughout the functional life cycle of your organization. And if I can feed those data elements and those streams and that information in through the statistical model, along with all the other data elements that we typically bring through to look at the performance of our organization, and then consume all that through the enterprise data warehouse platforms, then I can start to find out not only how are we doing as an organization, but what is it that we're doing that's keeping us from hitting our next set of goals? And if we can make a changes, what's our prediction for uplift, whether it's on the top side or taking out costs so that I can get a better margin, profit margin. And the last piece to get this whole closed loop corrective action cycle implemented is being able to take those actionable insights and feed them as messages back into the business community saying there's a tweak that we need to make in the way we're doing a campaign. There's a tweak in the way we are doing our sales contact activities and implement those changes. And that collaborative workflow, routing and alerting piece, it's not quite there yet, but there's components out there that I'm seeing forming. And a lot of these workflow products that have been around for years are starting to realize that they can integrate back into those insights coming out of predictive analytics. So this is the goal. And then to make a case, why am I trying to do predictive analytics? It's to help our savvy business owners have a higher level of confidence in some of the key strategic decisions they're trying to make by giving them some quantitative, high confidence probability factors that says, if you make this decision, we've mathematically walked through all the data and have come up with this confidence factor that says it's probably a good decision. All I'm doing is trying to give you an increased level of confidence to augment your gut and your business savvy that you always had. And there are just a couple notes from various research firms. The International Institute for Analytics, which is a research firm focused just on predictive analytics, they're making some predictions that predictive analytics are going to be implemented. The next killer app will be within security, running predictive models for either insider threat or cyber security threats. And that automated decision making, helping to automate the decisions with some of these predictive insights that are coming out of these analytics models is going to be a big impact. They're going to have profound outcomes that are waiting, but the big impact is institutionalizing these actions against these insights within the business processes, which is another key area that we have to focus on. And then, of course, according to IDC, when they're looking at the market as a whole, it's a huge market that's opening up. 125 billion worldwide just in 2015. And then the other thing that's an interesting point, they analyzed how many companies are going out and either purchasing or acquiring external data, which is a very key element to enrich our predictive models. And you can see right now that they're saying 70% of large organizations are doing something, and by 2019, everybody's going to be grabbing data. I was speaking with one of my colleagues, Mark Picos, and he was talking to me about the research he's doing. There's this new phenomenon that's coming on. It's open data that is sitting out all over the place out on the internet, but it hasn't been commercialized yet. We haven't figured out how to leverage it and use it. It's very similar to what Mark was sharing with me, the early days of the internet. We all had this internet. It was like, what do we do with it? And it wasn't until it got commercialized and we started using it for e-commerce and things like that, we were able to see the value proposition. The same thing's happening with this open market area. And if you're getting after predictive analytics, that external data is key to being a top competitor versus others that are not grabbing that data. A couple other data points. McKinsey Institute, they said people that are doing more advanced analytics with data, just in the US alone, in the manufacturing sector, retail and manufacturing sector alone, are going to make a huge contribution to the gross domestic product. And Sloan School of Business did their own research, and they said on average, the organizations that are using predictive analytics are outpacing their competitors by 5 to 6%, and that increase in productivity is based on causal relationships that they've been able to find and put a high probability factor around that they're really causal relationships to act on. So let's look at from the architecture standpoint. There's a big implication on our existing architectures, and I want to step back in time just a little bit. When we started building data warehouses, so mid to late 90s and then into the 2000s, the whole premise for why the whole data warehousing industry and the subsector of IT technologies formed was because we had technology constraints at the infrastructure layer and at the operating system layer and at the software layer, where the transactional processing system and the operational analysis or OLAP systems, those diametrically opposed workloads could not run on the same set of infrastructure. So we came up with, hey, why don't we separate it? And then why don't we start leveraging these technologies but put new design concepts down on there? And boy, we learned some lessons. I don't know how many of you have as many stripes on your back as I do. I'll call them scars versus the stripes on my shoulder. But our first implementations, they were kind of ugly, right? But we learned and we kept learning to the point where we created architectures that really have a lot of art form in them. And the whole time we're doing it was because we're constantly overcoming the constraints of the technology, the infrastructure layer, the operating system, and the software layer, until things like 64-bit addressing came along. The cost of RAM came down significantly. The software vendors started taking advantage of moving their file systems up into memory. The costs of infrastructure themselves have come down. And then we had this whole outlay of new products that have incubated out of the open source world that are very affordable. So what we have to think about is, while we had a great success unlocking that black hole in these ERP systems so that companies really did get their goal of being able to see how things are, Now we have to look at that art form that we have and start thinking about the fact that change is constant, and all those constraints that we built around, they're gone, they're dissipating. There is the ability to take advantage of new software that is extremely cheap, if not free, deploy it in a cloud, which is extremely fast and cheap, and you pay as you go. And then how do I start to wrap that capability around my existing infrastructure? Because low latency is very top of mind in the business community, especially when I'm trying to do something because I see an opportunity in the market, and those opportunities don't last for 6 to 12 months anymore. They're down to like 30 to 60 days. So I need the ability to be quicker to time to market, and I need the ability to start having systems that are more low latency in their insight generation themselves. And then the last point, as far as change is constant, when I look at my sons, 30 years old, 28 years old, those kids grew up with technology in their hands. He's a manager now, and his business, his technical savvy as a business owner or a business manager far outpaces anything that I've ever had as a technician, and I've been doing IT for since 1980. Right? And that, I'm seeing that over and over again as I go into organizations. The business savvy, the technical savvy inside the business is far more advanced than anything I've ever seen before. And their demands, they don't understand why things would take years and weeks, because they could cut that Ruby code or Python code overnight. Right? So there's this change that we have to react to and embrace. Just taking a step back and looking at the enablement, the evolution of the enabling platforms and tools. When we started doing analytics in the 90s, for the most part, the file management system was relational. The ETL tools were fundamental and basic. We were still writing a lot of SQL code. The reporting tools were just starting to come out. It was more static, pixel-perfect reporting, but it was a great start from what we used to have from the green bar reports, right? Data quality tools was all really non-existent. We were hand coding that. Statistical analysis tools have been around for a long time, but they've been locked in very succinct departments like actuarial services and fraud in the financial services area. And master data management, that was a promise for ERP, but it didn't materialize. And then data governance, we were just starting to understand the concept of data governance, because we're trying to take all this data, bring it together, and then make critical decisions off it. And then in 2000s, relational started to give way to various forms of massively parallel processing databases, and appliances were real exciting for a while. The appliances are now struggling for figuring out how they're going to continue to be relevant as cloud adoption takes place. And the ETL tools did get rich. They were very batch-oriented. A lot of them started figuring out how to do more message-based streaming of data or trickle feeding of data. And the BI tools continue to advance in their visualization and their interactive capabilities. The data quality tools started forming, but they got gobbled up by the ETL tool, the major ETL tool providers and the BI stacks. So they're more embedded components now. And then in the statistical analysis area, the open source community started showing up with alternatives to the large, more expensive licensed or subscription-based tools. And master data management was still pretty standalone, or was part of ETL stack, again, through mergers and acquisitions. And data governance continued to be real fragmented and, for the most part, elusive in most organizations. Some of it was built into ERP. Some of the ETL vendors tried to offer capabilities, even the BI vendors, but big, arduous, difficult to implement solutions. And then business discovery tools showed up on the market in the late 2000s. And that changed the game in the BI world, because it closed the gap that the end users were struggling with. I need this more unbridled access to diagnose and find data, not things that are preconceived and constrained. And now what we're seeing in this decade, a lot more in memory, and then of course the Hadoopalooza explosion, that has the promise of bringing in any kind of data very quickly, very cheaply. The ETL tools have followed right behind the success of the business discovery tools, the self-service concept. There's a lot of offerings for self-service data blending, data curation tools that those business-savvy business analysts or data-savvy business analysts can take and use to do their own blending. And then when I look at the data quality tools, again, that's pretty much the same thing. And then I've got several offerings I'm seeing out there, again, incubating out of the open source world for more productized, componentized, advanced analytic tools that lends itself to self-service advanced analytics. Richer transformation palettes on a user interface that allows an analyst to drop the kinds of statistical or predictive models onto their workplace and then connect the data into it. So the big message here is in this decade and going forward, self-service is all around the stack now, and it's something that we have to embrace. If we don't embrace it, it's going to happen without us as owners of the IT technical solutions. So let's talk about the advanced analytics products. They're not typical. They're not your typical BI project. They're very highly nuanced. You start out with a premise. You try to test that premise. You realize you need a lot more information available to feed that model to come up with something that finds the right variables and characteristics that are good signals for predicting future. So the project scope gets rewritten almost every day. And for the business, it's a mind mapping exercise. These projects are the way I think. That's kind of the nature of predictive analytics. And for IT that has a lot of rich methodology and a lot of rich architecture and governance, this is way beyond agile. It's agile on steroids. And the reason those things morph is the cause and effect. Trying to find that causal relationship ends up causing us to try a set of data and realize there's other kinds of data I got to bring in. So there's a constantly change of the initial planning of the project. And the nature of predictive analytics projects, it's very rapid prototyping. There's a lot of iteration cycles. And during those iteration cycles, again, a lot of change in scope, from our traditional mindset when we do a project to bring a new subject area in and provide a new set of KPIs to a business community. So, and I mentioned it already, but these analytics projects, to be really successful, we need a lot more context around our internal data. Most of enterprise data warehouses were built not with a data scientist in mind for the 2010 decade. Most of our enterprise data warehouses were built primarily to start with solid, golden, certified financial data, and then we expanded from that by having some richness around the orders so that sales could do some analysis, some richness around marketing so we could do campaign effectiveness and whatnot. But it was very more operational oriented in nature. So those data warehouses are somewhat terse in the richness of the kinds of attributes that are in there. Categorically, your mileage may vary. And when data scientists come in and they look, okay, so I'm starting with the enterprise data warehouse because that helps me understand the population within our distribution of customers. But in order for me to attack the tail end of those standard curves, to go after the outliers, to increase their acquisition of my products or services, I need additional information about that market that I'm trying to go after that I didn't capture as part of a byproduct of committing an order transaction. And the last point is, again, these iterative, the ability to have a high probability that you found a causal relationship is very difficult to do. And depending on the nature of the business transaction or the business decisions we're trying to augment, it could be very risky if I don't have a good high probability around those causal relationships. So that causes a lot of iteration. You have to do quite a bit of iteration, a lot of go, no-go decisions going on. Point I'm trying to get across is this is a very rapid, agile, chaotic environment that we have to figure out how do we embrace it and enable it as opposed to being afraid of it and running from it. I mentioned about the business discovery tools. When they came out, Gartner watched them for a while, and then finally at one point Gartner said, hey, there's a new magic quadrant. There's a new genre out here called business discovery. And what it has unlocked for the business analysts is the ability to diagnose and go beyond, this is where we are, and start to uncover, this seems to be the root cause. I have an idea or a hypothesis if I can do some diagnostics, right? That's a key because when you look at the overall enterprise, the overall stack of BI capabilities from standard reporting to ad hoc reports and then dynamic drill downs and drill arounds and all that, that layer helped us describe how things are going. Very important. The discovery tools allowed us to then also do some unbridled diagnosis as I'm looking at these results to drill around without any kind of preconceived constraints, doing some discovery around my data. And what I'm finding is the proper use of those business discovery tools becomes a great divining rod to feed the analytic targets or hypotheses into the predictive world, right? And then I can get into my more statistical modeling and predictive modeling because I have an idea around a business opportunity or a business problem that I found. Just to reinforce the need for enriching analytic models. So out of my internal data, of course, I get all my transactional information, all the quantitative measures, all the descriptive attributes, all my financial measures, even my qualitative measures, good orders, customer satisfaction kind of data. And I can also start to grab interactions, especially if I'm doing any kind of e-commerce, where I can watch how somebody's moving through my website, and when I see that they're deviating from our intended path, I can offer up prompts and messages, very, very impactful, so that I can affect the transaction while it's in process, as opposed to react after it's been abandoned. And then the other piece for enriching those analytic models is bringing that external contextual data in, observations about unsolicited behaviors and sentiments and feelings of the markets I'm trying to compete in, versus when I do customer surveys, I get a lot of good feedback whether a customer's a net promoter or a detractor, but the very nature of the survey is biased. So to augment that with hearing or getting a sense for what those same customers are doing unsolicited really does help me understand the overall behavioral patterns of these populations that I'm trying to target. And then, of course, being able to get after the significant events that are happening around the globe, because more and more companies are not local anymore. They're competing on a global basis because they have a multi-channel or an omni-channel sales model. And then there's an enormous amount of data flowing up from sensors, whether it's cars or fleet trucks or utility meters or our phones. Google Maps is really very, very effective at letting me know that I have traffic in front of me and reroutes me because it's constantly picking up messages from all the phones that are on that same path. All that kind of information is extremely enriching to feed into this whole causal analytics. Right? And it's a challenge to bring that external data in because I have to figure out how to blend it. I have to figure out how to curate it and condition it so that it's meaningful and useful to feed into these predictive models. And I can't wait to go through an ETL cycle to get it into the enterprise data warehouse because I'm moving quickly. As I mentioned before, our time span to hit some of these opportunities is shrinking down into weeks and months. Another thing from the perspective of architecture is when you embark on starting to do analytics projects, the outputs from those models, those predictive models, is producing data that is produced nowhere else in the organization. And that data, the insights, the targeted goals, the measures that were used for those goals, all those details need to be fed back into the enterprise data warehouse because as these analytic models are implemented, there's a need to do ongoing monitoring of those models so that I'm looking for decay in my expected outputs. And if I'm seeing the effect of an increase of take rate of campaigns and an increase in sales conversion ratios, but then I see a decay of that shortly after the first stimulation and the first set of responses. I need to be monitoring that, as well as I need to be monitoring drift of the model itself, where if the model had a high probability that these customers exhibiting these kinds of behaviors are going to buy these products, and then I see that that probability is changing, I need to be able to react to that. And the way I need to react to that partly is the implementation of any model that has a target and has a set of insights has to be brought back into the historical repository with a timestamp, so I can constantly monitor as I'm seeing new transactions flowing through against our targeted objectives. So we have to consider, I have a new data source that's going back into the enterprise data warehouse. A lot of research that's been done by IDC, and Gartner's been on this as well, is this concept of the third platform. The first platform way at the bottom was mainframe. The whole mainframe solutions that supported us for many, many years and probably are still supporting many companies. The second platform was distributed systems, where we went all the way to one guardrail, and then we kind of came back and balanced it out. But instead of having large mainframe systems, I could start to have a distributed set of server components with client applications interacting with it. And now the third platform is really, and the components of it are still up for grabs, but Gartner's LexisNexis of the next platform, IDC's definition of the third platform. The one thing that's in common, or the four things that are in common, is it's the leveraging of mobility applications, leveraging cloud computing services, taking advantage of social media and any other kind of open data, Internet of Things kind of data, federal government published data, et cetera, and taking advantage of the big data capabilities and the analytics products that I can put down on top of it is forming the basis for the third platform. And the reason I bring that up is when you think about the dynamicism of predictive analytics, they're very agile, very, very iterative. I need to move very quickly. In order to do some of those things, I need, my sense and what I've seen in the market is give these guys a lab. Give them a data lab, an analytics lab, not even just a data lab, but give them a lab environment that doesn't cripple anything in production, that I can have a set of governance that allows information to flow into that data lab, enabled with tools, enabled with the right people with the right skills to get their job done, and their outputs can be fed back in for decisions whether those outputs should be hardened into a regular persistent thing in the enterprise. And leveraging a cloud-based solution allows very quick scalability, very quick provisioning. It's very affordable. You only pay what you need and what you use. So the third platform is another component that I want everybody to keep thinking about. Is like, how do I embrace this dynamic world of advanced analytics when I've got a very rigid architecture in place, right? Some additional data points out of IDC. Cloud adoption is definitely happening in various forms, either pure public cloud or hybrid cloud or private cloud. And the cloud providers and the big three that are surfacing, it's Google, it's Amazon's been around a while, and Microsoft. All of them are figuring out how to enable the analytics stack with different kinds of capabilities. And they're all adopting a standard around being able to put a container around your application. So if you start by building it in Amazon and you want to move it to Google, you can move the container, which is very attractive, especially for organizations that don't want to be locked into any one provider, right? So, just reinforcing that whole concept I talked around prudent investment. So I've got an on-premise architecture, a rich enterprise data warehouse with all of its governance, with all of its componentry in place. It's Teradata, it's Informatica, it's SaaS, it's the business object stack, et cetera. And I've also dabbled in the Hadoop world. So instead of using Oracle databases, I'm now using Hadoop for my staging areas, for example, right? And then I've got this need, this dynamic need for standing up labs because I have an episode that I need to address, or I want to create an ongoing R&D group that from one week to the next, the research might vary widely, and that drives the need for a lab-type environment, a lab-type ecosystem that allows for elastic demand because that's very cost-effective. And if I want to do a POC, one of the big risks that I run into a lot when I'm trying to sell that to the C-suite is, well, how much is that POC going to cost? And if I offer up a number that's north of $25,000, they're like, I like the value proposition, but that's a little costly, right? So that elastic demand, and then enable it with the kinds of tools that allows the persons that know their data to dynamically blend the golden source data from the enterprise data warehouse with this external data that they're bringing in that they know is useful to enrich their models. And being able to then have, using those proper tools, they all have a metadata repository. And if these data scientists are doing all that arduous work to figure out how to integrate data and then how to clean the data for their purposes, I guarantee that there's going to be some of that work that is leverageable that should be put back into the enterprise data warehouse for consumption across all domains. And all the hard work was done for me as an IT guy because my SME did the work and has already signed off on it. I just have to take that metadata, queue it up as a project, and eventually get it into the enterprise data warehouse. But the use of that end result is still happening in the lab until all that data is now flowing from the warehouse. So let's talk a little bit from the organization side. So the most often the reasons for analytic, even very compelling analytic POCs or analytic programs failed is because the nurturing of the culture to embrace this new way of augmenting decisions was overlooked. And it starts with a lot of focus around how do I create this collaborative mindset, open up and be more transparent, be more free to share information as opposed to prove to me why you need this information from me, so that I start to create this culture of, hey, together we can do a lot more things than separately we've been able to do. Because there's a lot of converging forces. When I put on my IT hat, and I've been in the IT side of things for forever, and I'm a proponent of architecture that's resilient and repeatable and reliable. I'm a proponent of the right kind of governance to keep us out of hot water with regulatory agencies. I realize that I have service level agreements and I have windows within which I can deliver the right data at the right time. But the business is over there saying, I need the data now and I can't wait for you. And so what has happened is there's a lot of shadow IT that has formed. If we can change that around and say, rather than you feeling like you have to be in a closet, how about if we start to figure out a way to enable you? How do we figure out a way to start collaborating more, co-development models? I'm seeing are very successful in global 50 companies down into young startups, so that I can start to create that cultural shift. So out of there's an annual CAO summit that is hosted by the International Institute for Analytics. And then I looked at the thought leadership that comes out of TDWI. And some of the key areas when I'm thinking about culture for success in advanced analytics is around building this sense of trust as opposed to the sense of distrust, right? Building a culture that says, heck yeah, let's share this stuff. We don't have to worry so much about misuse because we're trusting each other. And we got a common set of ethics that we're going to follow, right? And let's collaborate more. And then have an analytics ecosystem that's not only technology, it's not only the software and provisioning in cloud, but it's the ecosystem around the processes on how I'm going to embrace these outputs and figure out how I'm going to change my business process, right? And then the last piece is, this is some dynamic things, and the very nature of these predictive analytics programs, you learn that you learn a lot of things because you fail a lot. and you fail fast. And there's a need to have a feeling of support that failing is actually a very good thing. Because if you're not pushing the envelope, you're not trying to innovate, if you're not failing, you're probably being a little bit too conservative. I want to embrace you. I want you to get out on the edge. When I laid out that adoption process around, when I laid out that evolution of the technologies, there's also kind of a counterpart to an evolution in roles and responsibilities. And the point on this slide is, as we move into 2010, there's a lot of self-service happening. A lot of the work that was traditionally IT that has, over time, we've all got huge project backlogs. And I'm being categorical. I'm sure some of your shops are awesome, but categorically, the business is constantly waiting. They want better, faster throughput, right? And the self-service model enables them to do a lot more on their own, which is actually a benefit for the technical side of the house because they know their data a lot better, and it's a lot more effective to let them interact with it until they see it, versus me sitting down and say, okay, what do you need? And I write a business requirement specification document, and then a system specification document, and then I go try to code it, and it's wrong anyway, right? So the point is, I've got a lot of self-service enablement that is already happening, and that is something for the entire organization to embrace, because now I have the SMEs working with the data that know the data, and I'm enabling them to be much more dynamic, and I have a governance model that allows us to get together and say, okay, which of this should I bring back in to the enterprise data warehouse architecture so I can publish it to everybody based on the rules that you discovered. There's 2 officer suite roles. I won't say it's necessarily a title, but definitely 2 roles that have formed. The Chief Analytics Officer, who really shapes the demand for data and starts to drive data and treats it as a strategic asset. And that shaping of the demand is because, as a trusted partner to all the lines of business, the analytics officer role is starting to identify the kinds of advanced analytics programs that need to be happening across the organization in a proper kind of sequence so that they don't become conflicting efforts. I don't start to generate conflicting stimuli against the same population and produce conflicting behaviors when unbeknownst to the other ones, right? So that trusted line of business partner working across the functional area and supports that building of the ecosystem, the analytics ecosystem, primarily on the business adoption side of it, and embraces and wants to fund the technology side of it. And as part of being a trusted line of business partner, that person's a very gifted storyteller. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking about being a charlatan or anything, that the outputs from these predictive analytics efforts, they're very technical, they're very mathematical. And you have to translate that into, what does this mean for you as a chief marketing officer? Let me explain that. I need to be able to translate this very low-level set of mathematical stuff into something that makes sense to you as a business person. And then back to the feeling supported, this role is the role that says, I own all outcomes. I own all failures, and I share all successes with the team that did great work to create that trusted feeling of support. And then the other role is the chief data officer. And there's been several research papers that have just been released around the evolution of these 2 roles in organizations. And the chief data officer primarily focuses on delivering data and delivering it and treating it as a strategic asset so that there's a constant insurance of the right data quality and the right amount of reuse across the organization. Simplifies the access to the data as opposed to putting up barriers to getting access to the data, and continues to collaborate with the business to take out the riot, the redundant, the incorrect, the obsolete, and the trivial data so that the right kinds of data are constantly being managed in this data asset. And the net result is IT gets faster. I'm focused on the curation and provisioning of data, and I'm collaborating with the SMEs that have told me the rules for that curation and provisioning. So everybody's got to have an analytic, a maturity model, so I get to put one up, all right? The first, level, this is from a predictive analytics perspective. And as I'm walking through this, if you wouldn't mind, think about where is your organization now and where would you like to be in the next 6 months or maybe next 12 months. Most organizations, from an analytic standpoint, I might have a rich enterprise data warehouse architecture and a rich set of reporting, operational reporting, but when it comes to doing predictive analytics, I might be impaired because I don't know the quality of the data for my purposes. The data is still in silos because I need to bring all this external contextual data together. And if I'm doing any kind of predictive analytics, it's been very tactical. It's been black ops. I'm trying to incubate an idea to win somebody over. And I still, as a culture, I still have a great deal of opportunity to help the decision makers feel comfortable that I'm not displacing them. I'm trying to help improve their confidence. Right? And then the next layer would be, I found some local sponsors. I'm still lacking that top management passion, but I'm starting to get some good messages out there of successes. And I've got some small proof of value projects that have produced a very compelling ROI, and then as we implemented a pilot of that, we're seeing the actual ROI is playing out. And then from there, I start to move into what I'll call the aspiring organization, where as an organization, we start to find our distinct capability with regard to predictive analytics. Right? It might be in a particular functional domain of the organization, or it might be around the core revenue generation element of our organization, but I found a distinct capability that is allowing me to start to outpace and outmaneuver my competition. And I'm leveraging those successes from the proof of values, and I'm starting to build on that distinct capability, and I'm starting to get better at targeting and measuring my outcomes so that I'm proving that the proposed outcome has actually come to fruition. And I'm showing the impact on the financials of the organization. And then I move to like an enterprise stage where my analytics center of excellence starts to form because I have multiple lines of business that have been working together and collaborating, and they all said, we need to form a forum for us to continue to collaborate. Not a committee, a forum, an open forum for anybody at any level of the organization to come and share their ideas and successes and failures, right? And as a result of that, there's this permeation where thinking analytics starts to become top of mind across the organization as far as culture. All the way to the point where you get to this competitive state where companies start saying, I'm not a mortgage lender, I'm an analytics company. And I've heard that from an online mortgage vendor. Or I hear people like GE CEOs, we're not a manufacturer of big components for airplanes, we're an analytics organization. Right? So analytics becomes our strategic advantage. And I'm using analytics to incubate innovation, to take on some bolder moves that I never thought I would do before. Allows me to get into new ventures. It might even allow me to create new kinds of technologies. Right? And to navigate that curve, if I'm at the impaired state, some of the things that need to be done is look at that data governance model and say, how do I expand that governance without bringing out a bigger gavel? How do I expand my purview of what governance means so I can start to embrace things? How do I create and incubate a little analytics coalition? Find a sponsor, do a little POC, create a little coalition around that, tell a very gifted story, and then move the next phase, which once I get the localized, I'm socializing my wins, I'm proving the value of analytics, and I've established a method for measurable outputs, so it's very objective. That gets me to move to aspiring, and once I'm there, I'm driving to know my distinctive capability, and I'm applying analytics towards that distinctive capability, and I continue to implement those monitoring processes, which gets me to the enterprise level. And once I'm there, now I'm focused on cross-functional line of business analysis. I'm trying to permeate it across the enterprise, right? And that finally gets me to that competitor state where I move from analytics are us to innovation are us. Right? And then a quick look at the talent. McKinsey, the research that was done several years back, but I found these numbers to be compelling. The demand for predictive analytics talent just in the US, those are some pretty compelling numbers. I think I'll be a data scientist because there's going to be a lot of demand for it, right? But even more compelling is those business savvy, analytic savvy managers that are comfortable using data to help make their management decisions. 1.5 million more data literate managers. That's compelling. And when you look at the average breakdown, so this is a result of input from TDWI, input from the International Institute of Analytics and Gartner, and then some, digging out some research papers around from IDC and whatnot. Here's the average breakdown of the talent pool. The number of people you need to put in here depends on how deep you're going and how many projects you're trying to do and at what level of throughput. But when you break down your pool, roughly 5 to 10% of them will be those deep-seated PhDs in statistics that are building new kinds of models that address a gap that haven't been addressed by the library of models that have already been produced. And then the semi-pros or the accidental analyst or the business savvy folks that are very data comfortable analyzing data and seeing patterns, roughly 15 to 20% in my overall pool for that, so that I'm supporting those lines of business with business analysts. And then the rest of it are those managers that are leveraging the outputs and acting on those outputs and implementing the changes in their processes and monitoring the performance and the result of those processes. When you look at the data scientist, very coveted role, and the perfect data scientist is not your mere mortal. They're half analyst, they're half data miner, they're half programmer, and then half communicator. Very challenging to find one individual with those four halves. And to reinforce the point that I brought up earlier, at the last CAO Summit in 2014, all three of the Analytics for Excellence award winners said the key to their success was they hired a data journalist to tell the story, to work with the data scientist, to turn all of that mathematical speak into business impact speak across the whole life cycle of all projects, right? So if you put the two of those roles together in a collaborative forum, you get to the point where you got a maven, someone that is sharing wealth and knowledge based on experience. And going after this kind of talent, one opportunity is developing the more predictive analytics capability talent by organically looking for the folks within the business communities that have a propensity to analyze data and have them go through some statistics background, some fundamentals, and then unleash them with some of these tools that have these predefined transforms and let them grow on their own. The other would be contracting with consultants, because from there you get experience across multiple kinds of implementations across multiple industries, and challenge them to help your organization learn from their experience and mentor your organization. Right? Of course, connecting with research firms and getting research briefs out of them and finding if they know people. And then the last would be from a hiring standpoint, definitely out of universities. There are many universities in the States now that have business analytics functional disciplines under their colleges of business, where they're focusing on teaching a combination of statistical analysis, predictive analysis, and then mapping that back into their business administration degrees. And the young talent that I'm seeing coming out of these universities that are being hired into the business units are amazing. So that's a very fruitful area if you don't have intern programs to look into that. And then, of course, just poach people from other departments or from your consulting firms that come in and work for you. Right? The last point I'm going to make is, and this is kind of near and dear to my heart, I'm a data architect by passion when you look at the whole stack. That's what I did. I did a lot of data architecture oriented work as I worked on large programs or small projects. And I'm seeing a shifting role, or shifting of my role as a data architect. And it goes back to, we did a lot of design almost to an art form to overcome those technology constraints. But those technology constraints are starting to go away. So a lot of things that I used to have to do, I don't necessarily have to do those anymore. I don't have to spend all that expensive time on that. Maybe it's time for me to start looking at how can I be more in the space of this collaborative area where I've got an enormous amount of wealth around what all the data means across all the functional areas of the company. How about if I can start morphing myself to do more of a business analyst kind of role and figure out, as we implement these predictive analytics, to build that collaboration fabric. How do I flow the insights back to the operational area, leveraging my knowledge of the business because I know a lot about the data. So to wrap up the key points, these projects are extremely impactful. It is a differentiator, and it's been proven. There's so many case studies out there, and I know it's hard to internalize a case study because that's not us, but the reality is more and more companies are getting after it, and it's important to get on the bandwagon because it is very impactful, but it requires an extreme amount of embracing of agility, both from an architecture standpoint and more importantly from a governance standpoint. So we have to think how to expand our scope of governance without bringing out a bigger gavel, right? And then the culture is, without a doubt, that's the biggest barrier right now. It's not a technology barrier. There's a little bit of process barrier, process implementation and adoption, but that's because the culture is the problem. And then the key is we need a lot of leadership that's promoting collaboration, and we need a good storyteller to help people understand the value proposition. And then there's new kinds of talent. And at the end of the day, putting that data asset on the balance sheet is the key. How do I monetize our data so that it is actually directly responsible for generating increased revenue or taking out costs of our organization?